we can spend the full hour with you all. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Krista Egger, and I lead our Green Communities work at Enterprise. We are gathered here today to discuss how to create green affordable housing with the New York City Overlay of the 2020 Enterprise Green Communities criteria, a green building program designed for the affordable housing sector with a long track record in New York. Last week, in the first session of this weekly series we're having in July, we shared an overview of the 2020 overlay and the HPD protocol. And today we'll discuss the refreshed approach to integrative design in the 2020 overlay, including two key tools, the Project Priority Survey and New York City's Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines Exposure Screening Tool. So I'll be joined by Shelby O'Neill with Green Communities and Erica Joswiak with the Mayor's Office of Resiliency as we go through the next hour. So I'm really pleased to be joined by both of them. And as you all know, we are using Zoom today. If you're experiencing any difficulties with connectivity, try closing other windows or browsers that you might have open. That usually helps. And then if you're still having any issues with audio or video or anything else Zoom related, just please drop a note in the chat box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Gabby Morris-Flores from Enterprise is behind the scenes today and is here to ensure that you have a good online experience. So don't hesitate to do that. And then for the last logistic, we'd just like to share that we are recording today's session, and we'll email that file for you to share with your colleagues within the next week. And if you're interested in but did not receive the recording from last week, drop a note in the chat with your email address, and we'll make sure you receive that one too. Gabby sent that one out near the end of last week to everyone that registered then, but if it didn't come across your plate, we'd be happy to send it to you now. And the recording includes the visuals, the audio, and the chat log from the session, so you should be able to see everything all in one place. So speaking of chatting, we are going to try to keep a simultaneous Q&A going in the chat box while people are sharing information with the screen. So we'll have someone dedicated to both sections throughout today's session. So please don't hesitate to drop anything in that chat box. We'd really like to engage with you all that way. So with that, I'm going to share some slides to orient us to today's session, and then we'll really get going here. All right, so here's the cover slide for today's session. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the second of our weekly series in July for New York. If you joined us last week, you know that we had a great session. We were joined by Jen Leone from HPD and walked through an overview of the differences between the 2020 and the 2015 criteria, and spent time on walking through the HPD protocol, as well as when we're making the transition between the 2015 and the 2020 criteria. There were two questions that came through in the chat that we, during last week's session, that we did not have a chance to answer in real time. So right now, I'm going to put those questions with answers in the chat. So you'll be able to have that information handy if you'd like to review it. And then really want to thank you all for filling out the evaluation from last week's workshop. We got some great feedback that we're acting on in delivering today's session. And just wanted to note that there were many people asking for more examples, more detailed information about transition timelines and things like that in the evaluation. So I'm going to drop one additional thing in the chat right now to answer a question that folks had about where to find a detailed comparison of the 2020 to the 2015 criteria. So I just put that in the chat right there. HPD will shortly be publishing more specific guidelines about the transition timeline from 2015 to 2020 for those of y'all whose project timelines have been changing due to COVID and everything else that's happening right now. So you can be able to look out for that. And in the meantime, if you have any questions about that transition timeline, don't hesitate to reach out to your HPD project manager. So thanks again for participating in the eval, and look forward to more chatting today. And just a reminder, if you do want the recording from last week, if you can include your email address in the chat here, we'll be able to know where to send it. So thanks for that. So today's session is Success with Integrative Design. We have three main outcomes here. First, by the end of this workshop, we hope that you all will be able to identify how to maximize project benefit with integrative design, that you'll be able to evaluate how to approach the project priority survey, which is new for this version of the criteria. And third, that you'll be able to evaluate how to utilize the CRDG exposure screening tool. So those are our primary objectives for today. And for an agenda, I'll be done in just a second and then hand it over to Shelby, who'll go through highlights of category 1 and how to succeed with a project priority survey. Then we'll turn it over to Erica for how to succeed with the CRDG exposure screening tool. And then we'll close. And we'll pause for questions in between the transition from Shelby to Erica, and then at the end as well. So that's what we have in store for you all today. And in case you didn't join us last week, I did want to spend just a few minutes orienting you to our new 2020 criteria site, if you haven't been here already. So I'm going to drop in the chat a link to this site so you can access it if you'd like. And then, whoops, 1 second, let's fix that. And then what you can see on your screen here is the main 2020 site. And if you scroll down on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see this filter bar, which depending on which buttons you select, you'll see different information throughout this whole page. So if you click substantial rehab, all of the new construction criterion, for instance, will be grayed out for you. You won't have to bother with them. Or if you click new construction, you won't see any of the rehab info, for instance. And then if you click urban, you'll have the opportunity to click this box that you're in New York. And then now everything else on this site will reflect the New York City overlay information. So if you go within any of these sections here, you'll see the full criteria with a full requirement and rationale, recommendations and resources. Or you can choose to go to the shorthand version with this checklist. And with this checklist page, you'll have 3 ways of looking at a checklist that you can use depending on your preference. Either an Excel version that you can download and edit, a PDF version. And if you were looking at my cursor, I was pointing at the wrong thing. I was pointing at the national one. So the Excel and the PDF for New York here are where it says New York City Overlay. And then underneath here is an online editable version of the checklist that you can play around with and track your progress with this calculator on the right side of the screen. And then if you scroll farther down with that navigation bar on the side, you can go into appendices, which include the definitions for substantial and moderate rehab. You can go into addenda and FAQ if you'd like. You can click New York City Overlay to find the HPD protocol. And you can click on templates for certification, which I'm going to go into right now because we'll be spending a lot of time with 2 of the templates that you can find here today. So on this page, there is the instructions first about what's required to submit for certification, and then all sorts of templates on this page. And today we'll be spending time with this project priority survey that you can find right here, and the CRDG exposure screening tool that you can find right here. So that's what I wanted to show you on the site. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and see if Shelby's identified any questions that have come through in chat that we should answer. before we move on to the next session?
I think just if we could repaste the health and design answer, it looks like some of it got cut off and there was a request to repaste the whole thing. And otherwise, everyone will collect your emails and be sure to send out that last recording. So thanks.
Okay. Great. So I think that's it. Shelby, you can take it away. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Krista. Let me pull up my slides here. For those of you who I haven't had the occasion to meet or connect with, my name is Shelby O'Neill, and I help lead the certification program based out of DC, but calling in today from Massachusetts. So we're gonna do a quick overview of the highlights of Category 1 now, so that we'll be teed up to really dive deeply into what Krista mentioned, which is the Project Priorities Survey, a significant change to the criteria for 2020. So Category 1, Integrative Design. Why? Integrative design is really the backbone to a successful project. And I think that all of you New Yorkers and project team members in New York know that the need for a holistic integrative design process is only more critical now in 2020 as the affordable housing industry in New York reaches for greater performance and greater resilience and health benefits for your projects, all while grappling with tight project budgets. The concept and general objectives of an integrative design process are the same in the 2020 criteria as they've always been. So focused on engaging in a holistic approach to pre-design by prioritizing multi-layered information gathering from and about residents and the community to inform the design, setting goals for building performance and resident health and comfort, and encouraging buy-in and accountability from all project team members. So this is Category 1, or this is the criteria of Category 1. And I see that my little orange tags are all over the place there, but I think they're still legible. So with the 2020 criteria to support New York teams in engaging in a meaningful and successful integrative design process, we've really honed our approach and we've built in more opportunities in Category 1 for project teams to engage deeply with their residents and with their project teams and with a sharper focus on certain key themes of the 2020 criteria. So as I said, listed here comprises our Category 1, and the full content for these is available on the 2020 website and in the full manual that website Krista just shared. So I'm going to touch on these at a very high level right now. I'm going to skip over 1.1 and come back to that. Criterion 1.2, charrettes and coordination meetings, is really about employing the findings from the information gathering process in 1.1 and executing effective meetings for a successful integrative design process. Criterion 1.3, documentation. No surprise, we know that prioritizing green communities work in specs and CDs means that much more likelihood that projects will successfully execute these measures. So in 2020, the emphasis here is we want you to incorporate your specs and we want to see them. Let's see, 1.4, construction management. We're asking teams to develop an explicit education plan to ensure that practitioners on site really understand their role in achieving the project objectives. Criterion 1.5, health action plan. As we know, housing conditions impact resident health, so this is a really in-depth process to guide developers in integrating health into the design of their project. Finally, or almost finally, climate resilience, asking teams to gauge in a 4-part comprehensive vulnerabilities assessment and identify critical risk factors to implement to mitigate in their design. And finally, cultural resilience, big call out here. We're very excited to have our first criterion specifically focused on lifting up cultural resilience. So through this, we're encouraging resident input and community leadership, either by having teams create cultural resilience advisory groups in their communities or going through a cultural resilience assessment process. So as I mentioned, please read up on the additional details for these, because I'd like to spend the most time today talking through our criteria 1.1 project priority survey. So I'm gonna loop us back to that, but pause for a moment. Krista, are there any questions that we should address now that came through?
Nope, not yet.
Great. Okay. Project priority survey deep dive. For the next 20 minutes, we're going to really sharpen our focus on this PPS, as we call it, provide an overview of the tool while examining each topic within that survey, the project priority survey, practice engaging actually with one of the features to fulfill one of the sections required, and also walk through maybe an insider's view for how to successfully engage with the project priority survey. So this is big. This is a big change for 2020. I think we might say it's where the rubber meets the road in the holistic integrative design process. I'm going to pause as I start to dive into what the project priority survey is and actually pull it up. And Krista will go ahead, please, if you would, and share out that link so that you may all open the survey, an editable version of the survey on your screen, and follow along with me if you'd like to. So I'm gonna see if I can elegantly switch screens here. Aha. Okay. Great. As I'm going, as Krista shared earlier, please pose any questions you have through the chat and we'll catch them either at the end of this section or later, later on. So what is the project priority survey? The project priority is a tool developed with lots of blood, sweat, tears, and heart to enable teams to establish the context, the population needs, and environmental considerations for your project as part of a really intentional, genuine, integrative design process. Krista shared a link to the PPS, which exists as I think she also called out on that templates for certification page on the 2020 website, which actually links to the Enterprise Resource Center where you can download this editable version of the PDF. You can also go directly to the Enterprise Resource Center from our homepage. There's a non-editable PDF format in the appendix section of the 2020 website, and actually, if helpful, there's also a hard copy as part of the hard copy manual appendix. So many ways to handle and work with the survey. So at a relatively high level, but calling out some key points here, I'd like to walk through it with you all. Starting with section 1, populations served. Really, the point here is that it's important to understand who the project is designed for. So we're just looking for basic info on the residents and checking a box so that we know what type of residents will be served and start to paint the picture for who will be using the building. Related to that, we're actually interested in hearing some resident expert input. So gathering information by asking teams to really take time to understand the community experience around the project so that the project can respond to resident and community needs and lift up community assets. As part of this section, we're asking teams to engage in specific conversations with residents and potential residents, property management, and then so that they're able to reflect on these community experiences through a series of questions designed to generate really critical thinking about the community experience of the project. And then the next section here to really, oops, I think I missed it. Excuse me, ground truth. My mouse got away from me. To ensure that this information gathering from residents is meaningful and effective, this section asks teams to be thoughtful about how then they're collecting feedback from these players. So I think I recommend everyone to read through these sections. It looks like a lot of text, but I think you'll find that we're asking for really straightforward information and action here to engage with the community. Next up, I'm going to move to, oops, my little screen flashed up, excuse me. Looking at resident opportunity factors. So, excuse me. We know that the design and development and operations and maintenance can really impact outcomes for residents and health and resilience, to name a few. So here, we're asking teams to gather specific community opportunity factors that can be considered for the project to provide better outcomes for their residents. I'd like to pause here for kind of an experiment large group activity. We're going to actually test drive the tool that we're asking teams to engage with to complete this portion of the survey. So I'm going to have to do some sort of magician-like toggling for a moment, if you'll bear with me. Oops, excuse me. Let's see. I'd like to ask folks who are able to test drive this with me, as I mentioned, to familiarize ourselves with how to complete this section. It might seem a little intimidating engaging with a new program, but I think it's less scary than it looks and is pretty interesting and fun. So let's just go through the steps here for a moment, and I will actually pull up the Opportunity 360 webpage with you. So asking that you please go to the link that I think Krista just shared, or you can pull it off of this slide and scroll down to the page, or excuse me, scroll down to the subheading to measure, and I'm going to do that with you. Oops, I'm one step ahead. I'm sorry. I was doing this before. Here we are. If you can go to this Opportunity 360 website, go to measure, and you should then be able to scroll down and add a project address or your home address or your best friend's address or your worst enemy's address, and request a dashboard to collect information on these opportunity outcomes. So let's take a minute for everyone to add an address and select Request Dashboard. Then we'll go back to what we were talking about in the actual PPS document, and in a few minutes resurface this to see what we found. So here I go. And please shout with questions. Oh dear, I had this. Oh, that's the key. I always forget to select the map. And then I'm entering my name. Info is here. Great. Okay, I'm gonna switch back and just wait a moment to let everyone else engage before I dive into more content. While I'm doing this, Krista, are there any urgent questions that have come up to help people facilitate this that we should address?
Nope, I think you can keep going.
Awesome. Okay. So moving along in our survey, which I'll acknowledge it looks lengthy. It's 8 pages long, but I hope once you have a chance to get intimate with it that you'll see that it's really clear, and I think you'll be able to be successful with it. So understanding building emissions. Here's really an opportunity to reduce emissions if that's a priority for your project. So essentially focusing your attention on key opportunities within our criteria in category 5 to reduce emissions. And we'll dive into category 5 in a later session, but encourage you, if that's a priority for your project in New York, to understand from here how these work together to minimize your carbon emissions. And next up, we have a section on environmental and climate resilience, but instead, and I keep having to remind myself of this, so I'm happy to continue to remind you all, but we'll learn more from Erica, who's joined us today from the Mayor's Office of Resilience, but New York teams actually will ignore this specific section and replace it with the New York City Climate Resiliency Screening Tool. So more to come on that. But essentially, project teams are looking at hazards and how to respond to them. Finally, we're asking teams to be really intentional about what their project mission is. So what will the project achieve for the community when the building is up and running? There are examples here, and we have some great tools for teams to utilize to generate their project mission based on their ideas and intentions for the work. But a project mission should be short. It should be thoughtful, and it should ensure that all team members understand and support the mission, or part of the process to develop it really should be to do that. So that is our project priority survey. And in a moment, we'll talk about ways to approach it to be successful, but I'm just scrolling back up. So again, you have an overview of the whole thing here, and in a moment, we're gonna check on our Opportunity 360 dashboards, but certain sections ask for more effort than others. Some sections just ask for checking boxes and providing input. And I just encourage you all to explore it so that it's familiar and you're prepared to engage with it in a meaningful way. All right, let's check back on our resident opportunity factors. We'll take 2 to 3 minutes here and asking those that were able to access Opportunity 360 to check their email that they entered, that you entered rather. Sorry, there's a million people coming in and out right now. Okay, if you would, check your email and look at the opportunity outcomes that came in your specific dashboard for the address that you shared. And then once you've had a minute to look, and there's a lot of information here, encourage you all to please chat out one finding about your community. And I'm going to see if I can pull up my dashboard here. All right. All right. So from housing to education, health, economic security, and mobility. Can really get an intricate cross-section of your project site and community. Great. I'm going to see how we're doing in the chat here.
We're doing okay, Shelby. I mean, sorry, no feedback is coming in the chat yet.
No feedback. Okay. Great. I'll stick to my word and give you all another minute. And really anything that stands out. Why don't I find one? I entered the town that I'm in currently in Massachusetts. Great.
Shelby, it looks like people are haven't received their dashboards yet, so
Okay.
Maybe we could assume that they'll get them in the next minute or two and can follow up on this after the workshop.
Yeah, great. Okay. I'm sorry, I timed it at about 5 minutes. In any case, I think that you'll find that you'll learn some really interesting information when you work with the Opportunity 360 tool as part of the PPS, and have fun with it. Feel free to share out if you do see anything come back as we continue our discussion here. And hopefully this illustrates that that information can be captured rather easily for the PPS for this section. Rather easily, maybe not timely, but I do expect you'll get an email in a moment. All right, segueing back, I'd like to talk about ways to be successful completing the project priority survey. So to start, I think I acknowledge that it's a lengthy document. Sure, there's a lot of text and links and charts, and it looks intimidating. But if you really read the content, it's not so scary. For instance, the building emissions section is really optional. The project mission section is intended to be brief, asking teams to generate thought together, but really is something that can be done in a short period of time. So I think that you'll all be successful with the document and encourage you again to familiarize yourselves with it. And as always, reach out for questions. But then looking at when should the PPS be completed? So as always, start early. We're looking for the project priority survey to help inform the integrative design process, and we're looking to see it completed as part of your pre-build application. So we ask you to start early, not because it takes any length of time to complete necessarily, but because it leaves time for it to be really useful in how you design your building, and allows you to be thoughtful in the way that you're engaging with residents and gathering information. Who should complete the project priority survey? Well, I guess the more the merrier on one hand, bringing together as many team members as you're able to gather broad input is important, but also know that any project team member is welcome to complete the survey. So do what you're able to do there and gather input, but know that there's no specific requirement associated. One question that might come up is how our team will be looking at the project priority survey when it's submitted for pre-build. And I guess what I want to just get across is that this is really a tool to help your team information gather. When our team is reviewing a PPS, we're looking for it to be complete. There are no wrong answers unless it's not completed and sections are left blank. But the more thoughtful and inclusive teams can be with their teams, I think the more helpful this process and document can really be for informing the project and essentially having a successful project. And one tip actually that might be really helpful is that the survey isn't necessarily a linear process. There are certainly some small portions that build off each other, but you can do it in the order that suits you. So if you need to organize more to prepare for speaking with residents and community experts, maybe starting with the project mission, or starting looking at whether you'll measure building emissions is an easier place to start. So, dive in when you're able, where you're able, start where you're comfortable. And I think that will also help you get comfortable and engage more. I think that you'll see that you can use the project priority survey and use it well, and your project and residents will benefit for it. Before I recap, Krista, are there chat responses or questions that we should address now?
Nope, I think you can go ahead and wrap up, Shelby.
Great. So we've spent the last 20 plus minutes walking through the PPS, trying to engage with the Opportunity 360 tool, and discussing at a high level ways to be successful. So I'll hand it back to Krista now, who will transition us to hear from Erica, I think. Thanks, Krista.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. And Erica, you can go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Shelby. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, how's that looking for people? Can you see that?
Good, thanks.
Okay, so with a couple minutes we have left, I'm just going to go through the climate resiliency design guidelines and a specific tool that's located within them called the exposure screening tool. we are going to discuss how this fits into the enterprise green community criteria, and then hopefully have a little bit of time for questions. Some of you may be familiar with this document already, so I'll just give a very brief background. The climate resiliency design guidelines were created by the Mayor's Office of Resiliency to aim to create a more resilient, equitable, and vibrant city for New Yorkers today and for generations to come. And the design guidelines themselves are organized to try and address both the shocks that we kind of think of associated with climate resiliency, like the Hurricane Sandys or the nor'easters that we have with increasing frequency every year, but also to address those climate stresses that are going to be the more chronic issues that we'll see on our capital projects, things like tidal flooding, higher than average temperatures, or groundwater rise. We're making a lot of investments in the city right now that will exist over a long period of time. This is something that we'll continue to revisit in terms of climate resiliency. So we need to be thinking about the stresses of tomorrow when we're doing our design today. And the way that we are working to do that is to incorporate climate change data into design to improve the performance of capital projects to manage the increasing loads from these shocks and stresses. And the goal of the design guidelines is to establish a consistent approach for using forward-looking climate data across the entire city capital plan. We get this climate data from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, so it's localized climate data. And through that, we understand that our biggest climate-related hazards are extreme heat, extreme rainfall, tidal inundation with sea level rise, and coastal storms. The guidelines apply to all New York City capital projects, including both new builds and substantial improvements, and all types of capital projects, including building projects that we're going to discuss a little more in depth today. And right now, these are guidelines. These are not mandated. However, we know that resilient design may soon become law. It's a stated goal of the New York City Council to mandate the climate resiliency design guidelines across all projects. It's something that we are preparing agencies, and agencies like HPD have absolutely spearheaded the incorporation of the CRDG into their work. So it is something that we are forecasting will be required in the near future and are trying to prepare projects accordingly. So we address these different stressors by identifying the risks associated with each one of our climate parameters, assessing how big that risk is to the project, and then selecting the appropriate design intervention that will mitigate the risk to the best of our ability. We'll go into some of these design interventions very high level later on in the presentation, but the importance of this is that it's going to be tailored to each individual project. There's no one size fits all solution. And so we're hoping to give a kind of a toolbox of what some mitigation strategies might be. And these design intervention is also going to give you points in the Enterprise Green checklist. So some important things to differentiate here is that the guidelines will be differentiating between short-term and long-term components. So for example, if you're starting with a new build, completely new building, it may have a longer useful life, maybe towards the 2080s, and therefore will experience a greater breadth of climate stressors over the course of its useful life, as compared to something like an HVAC upgrade, which may have a shorter useful life and therefore will have a shorter window or range of climate stressors that it may be exposed to. So those differentiations are incorporated into the guidelines. And important to realize that this is not the only time that we've taken climate data and put it into our codes and standards. We already use historic climate data, and now we're just looking into that forward-looking data to be able to better prepare our very significant investments for the future. And like we were saying here, HPD and the Enterprise Green have incorporated many of the tenets of the guidelines into their work. And specifically, we will be discussing some of the exposure screening tool results today. These I'm going to go through pretty quickly because they're all in the document, but it's an example of some of the data sets that we provide to designers. This is an example of some of the climate stress for heat, where you can see that the number of heat waves per year is anticipated to increase the longer the useful life of the building. So you can see here, if you're in the 2080s, you could anticipate that your building would experience up to 9 heat waves per year. And these are going to be associated with certain design criteria. Because where HVAC has this shorter useful life, we only are providing certain types of design criteria because you are anticipating that the HVAC will be replaced before the 2080 cycle. However, the intention of this is to say, you're going to want to design for a certain amount of cooling degree days that will serve you over the course of the life of your investment. Same thing for precipitation here. We are working with the Department of Environmental Protection to incorporate their unified stormwater rule criteria, which separates their best practices into the MS4 or the CSO areas. This, I'm not going to spend too much time on. Many of these information about the unified stormwater rule is on DEP's website. And then lastly, our last climate stressor of the sea level rise. This provides an example of how projects that are in the current or future floodplain can take into account different levels of sea level rise adjustment to determine what their design flood elevation will be. And this will help us to make our assets more resilient, both again right now and then also at the end of their useful life, to ensure that they're going to be operating over the entire life of the asset. Okay, so that was definitely a very quick background. Are there any kind of initial questions on the CRDG in general before we jump into the tool?
Nothing's come through on chat yet, Erica, but I'll let you know.
Okay. So the exposure screening tool is a tool that we have put together to identify and assess climate-related hazards and risks early in scoping and planning. This is a simple point system based on yes or no questions, and using this tool will help determine if the climate resiliency design guidelines are necessary for your project. So if your project is not in an area of like high heat vulnerability, then you will not have to do the heat mitigation strategies that the guidelines recommend because it's not a risk for your project. So having some of these yes or no questions early on will help to identify what type of design interventions you should anticipate to incorporate. And this also will help you understand what the high level severity of your exposure to climate risk is. So like how serious will this be? Are you in a very high risk for tidal flooding? And therefore it should be a major focus of your design, or are you very far inland and this is not really going to be something that impacts your project? This type of kind of binary yes/no tool early on in design can help save a lot of headaches later on, and also save money in design changes too. So I will just kind of give a walkthrough of some of the different sections. There are 3 sections of the exposure screening tool. And like I said, the tool is interactive. So for example, in this question, does this facility include new construction or substantial improvements to the landscape, hardscape, roof, HVAC, building envelope, ventilation system, or facade? If any of those are true, then you would, using this dropdown, would select yes or no. Yes would be equal to 1 point. Once you follow through with that for the rest of the criteria, your score is automatically calculated at the bottom here. And once you have this score, you can refer to the exposure rating. So here we would see that we have a score of 5. We have a low rating for our exposure to heat. So we know that this is not a major stressor for this project, and using the guidelines for heat would not be required. Same thing in the precipitation section, a couple of these yes or no questions that will then generate a certain score. Here we see that based on the facility requiring a site connection proposal, modification to the site plan, and a history of flooding events at the site, we have a score of 2. Therefore, this project has a medium exposure to risk associated with increased precipitation, and therefore this project would refer to the design guidelines for more specific direction about how to prepare for increased precipitation. You'll also notice that there is a budget component to this if you are above or below $50 million. This, I think, is more of an idea of if we're doing a major investment, then we're going to want to do more of a detailed risk assessment, of which there is also guidance in the document for. Not a requirement at this time again, but something that we want to make sure that if we're doing a pretty large infrastructure investment, then we want to make sure that we're really analyzing all of the risks. And then lastly, our sea level rise, same thing here. What we're trying to get at is, are you in the current floodplain? Yes or no? And then, are you in the future floodplain? So both of these can be found at the Flood Hazard Mapper website. Some of you may be familiar with that, where you can kind of toggle on layers and see where exactly your project is located and how to see if it's going to be in the current or future floodplain. Same process with the tidal inundation zone. And you'll get your score to kind of understand how exposed you anticipate this project to be, and if you need to start thinking about design interventions to mitigate that exposure. So now that we have a basic understanding of what the tool will allow you to do, we'll discuss briefly how and when to apply it. So like Krista and Shelby had mentioned, you can find the tool in 3 different places. It's in the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines themselves on pages 31 and 32, which are also linked on both the HPD and Enterprise websites. You can find a direct link to the tool on the Enterprise Green Communities website or on the Enterprise Green Community Templates certification component, which was pointed out in the beginning. And at both of those places, you're going to be able to download this PDF, which is, again, interactive. And here, I want to definitely make sure we will be updating this tool periodically with more information that we have. We have a version 4 coming out of the design guidelines soon. So I understand there's definitely a temptation to download the tool and just save it on your computer, but I recommend checking back at these websites. This will have the most up-to-date information. If there are any changes to the exposure screening tool, this will be exactly where it's updated. And then when to use this tool, we absolutely recommend doing this as early as possible. Doing this early is going to help to understand what type of design interventions you can anticipate to incorporate in your project and have that be a part of the initial scoping process. This is far easier to do during the scoping in the very early stages of planning in the integrative design process than it will be doing this at 90% design. This also is a required item in the pre-build process, and HPD reviews for the use of the exposure screening tool in their design consultation. So there's a couple of different touch points in which the exposure of the project will be questioned. More specifically on where this fits into the actual Enterprise Green overlay, the intake form is right at the beginning here in the BLDS intake. And again, this risk exposure tool is required for the submittal of the pre-build authorization forms. So you can see a couple of different places where this tool is going to be utilized. There may be some questions about like what level of exposure it is, where some of the information came from. But definitely really want to nail home that this is a early in design phase process for maximum beneficial results. And then finally here, some examples of the design interventions that could be identified once we understand what our exposure is. So you've gone through the tool, you've understood that you do have a heat risk or precipitation risk or climate risk on your site. How are you going to mitigate that? The design guidelines have specific examples of design adjustments to utilize and a kind of toolbox of different actual design strategies that can help to mitigate the risks associated with your exposure. So for example, some heat design interventions are utilizing shade structures, either in tree canopies or architectural shade, incorporating green infrastructure, which will also help you on your precipitation mitigation process. Working with things along the lines of passive house, of using high performance envelope and better performing mechanical systems. You're all going to help to mitigate some strategies from heat stress. Precipitation design interventions are very well focused on green infrastructure, but there also is some gray infrastructure solutions, such as upsizing your subsurface storage or redesigning some of the ways that you do detention tanks. And for sea level rise interventions, this is one that could be one of the more major changes to how we think about measuring resilience on a project. But could be things such as elevating either your critical components or the structure itself, creating items that are flood resilient, or thinking about either permanent protection or deployable protection. As we mentioned, many of these design strategies, number one, are going to be very site specific to your project and the opportunities therein, but also have a lot of overlap with other points in the enterprise green framework. So some examples of these are here. This is a non-comprehensive list, but a lot of the energy efficiency measures that we are also incentivizing during this work could help with the climate resiliency component as well. And last thing that I'll mention here is that the latest updates to the climate resiliency design guidelines are going to be incorporated into the fall 2020 trainings. So the most recent information from that will be incorporated into trainings going forward and will also be updated on each of the websites that we listed earlier. So that was definitely a little bit of a whirlwind of information, but thank you for allowing me to brief on this tool. I think it's a really great use in design and can take any of the initial questions now.
Great, Erica. That was a great overview. Thanks for all of the visuals and walking us through it also. We don't yet have any questions in the chat, but I'll give people a little bit of time to think about what they might like to ask, and I'll actually pull up some of our information here too. And as we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, just recap that we're nearing the close of our time together this afternoon in the second session of this July Wednesday series. We've discussed Category 1 with a project priority survey and the use of the exposure screening tool. And just want to recap for everyone, you know, some of the major changes between 2020 and 2015 with integrative design have to do with really actually considering this as an integrative process. You know, with 2015, we had separate questions for share your sustainability goals. We had a separate process for evaluate what the health priorities are of your residents and how to accommodate those. A separate question for looking at resilience. And now we're really trying to bring all of those together. And that's what the project priority survey does, like centering your project goals and mission on the needs and experiences of the residents or the impacted community, and then looking at the climate, resilience, health aspects all together. So that's one of the most significant changes. And then just a reminder with criterion 1.1, when you're using the exposure screening tool, you'll be looking to see if you have a low, medium, or high exposure rating in each of the 3 areas that Erica mentioned. And then if you would like to pursue criterion 1.6, you'll be looking at implementing various design strategies that are included in the tool. So Gabby, if you wouldn't mind pasting the eval link in the chat box so that people can give us some feedback on the session, that would be great. And we'll be sending out an email from Gabby's email address later this week that'll include both last week's recording, this week's recording, and additional links for follow-up information. So I think that brings us to the end here. So thanks again for joining, everyone. We'll follow up and hope to see you next week. Bye, everybody.